Now we're going to talk about water balance in some specific mammals. Um, in general, the amount of water that enters an animal system always has to be equal to the amount of water that's leaving the system. And of course, it doesn't have to, they don't have to be equal from one moment to the next, but they do have to average out so that they're equal, because if the water intake is not equal to the water output, um, you're going to have problems one way or another pretty quickly. Usually we worry about dehydration, and mammals get in trouble when they lose about 10 to 15% of their body weight in water. They are getting severely dehydrated, and then they're getting into trouble. If they lose 20% of their body weight in water, that will kill most mammals, losing that much water. And humans and dogs are about equivalent in terms of how well they tolerate dehydration. So, if a human or a dog loses about 20% of its body weight in water, that's going to kill it. And that translates to 1 or 2 days in the desert in the summer if you don't have access to water. That's about how long you could survive. Or less if you do something stupid, because there are always stories about the family driving in the car and the car breaks down and the father goes trudging off to go get help, and the rest of the family sits around in the shade of the car, and they're found and they're okay, and the father's found dead somewhere because he's trudging around in the middle of the day out in the desert, which is not something you can do for very long unless you've got a big supply of water with you. There are a lot of mammals that live in the desert, and they're able to deal with the limited water that's out there, and the way that they deal with it depends on the animal. One of the ways that desert mammals deal with the lack of water is by just getting enough water, and they can do this by eating wet food. So most of these mammals actually don't have any adaptations that allow them to tolerate dehydration better than mammals in general, but they're just eating food that has a lot more moisture in it. This is a cactus mouse. It's basically a little field mouse. It's in the same genus as field mice. It's in the genus Peromyscus. And this is a white-throated wood rat, which is in the genus Neotoma. Now this one is not in the desert, but white-throated wood rats live in the desert also. And so you'll find both of these species in the hot deserts of the southwestern US and northern Mexico. They both need a lot of water. They both get their water from their diet, and what they're able to do is get water from prickly pear cactus. And that prickly pear cactus or beaver tail cactus has a lot of moisture in the tissues of the cactus. Now, if you were trying to get water in the desert by, and you find a prickly pear, so you think, well, let me just, scrape the spines off and eat some of these cactus pads because there's a lot of water in there. That's true. It's very wet, but these cactus have a chemical defense. They produce oxalic acid. So if you try to start eating them in any quantity, you're going to get sick and you're going to start throwing up, and you're actually not going to do yourself any good. Both white-throated wood rats and cactus mice have the ability to tolerate high levels of oxalic acid. So they can get around the chemical defenses that the plant has evolved, and so they're able to basically eat food that has a lot of water in it and get their water from that. This is a North African sand rat, and it does something similar, although slightly different from cactus mice and white-throated wood rats. What they do is to eat halophytic plants. So halophytes are plants that tolerate salt. And if you ever taste the juices in a halophyte, it's really salty. And so, you run into the same kind of problem if you're eating a lot of halophytes as you would if you were drinking seawater. Yeah, it's water, but the salt concentration is so high that basically osmosis is pulling water out of your system if you drink seawater. And it would be the same thing with these halophytes. If you eat a lot of them, there's a lot of moisture in there, but it's not helping you because there's so much salt. Osmosis is going to start pulling water out of your system. Well, what North African sand rats are able to do is absorb that, and they have a kidney with uh, some special adaptations that allows it to deal with this extra salt and, essentially get rid of it. Carnivores generally don't have a problem. They are usually not especially dehydration tolerant because they're eating food that has a lot of moisture in it. So, again, they're eating, if you're catching something and eating it, it's usually going to have a lot of moisture in it. So a lot of carnivores don't need a lot of extra moisture. This is an oryx or a gemsbok, and this is a large mammal. It's a large antelope that lives in arid parts of Africa, and it can go for really long periods without drinking. Um, and it does that well, it's got a set of interesting adaptations. One thing that oryx do is maximize the moisture in the food that they eat. Now, during the dry season, they're basically eating a bunch of dry grasses. So you might think, well, they're dry grasses. There's not much water in there anyway. And that's true. However, at night, when it's cooler, those dry, dead grasses actually absorb a significant amount of water from the air. During the daytime, they're really dry, and so these animals eat them at night, right? Because if you eat the same grasses at night, you're going to get a lot more moisture in that food than if you eat them during the daytime. Oryx are also able to reduce their water loss with a series of adaptations. They do something called voluntary hyperthermia. So hyperthermia means high temperature. And so what they do is they are not holding their body temperature constant. They're allowing it to get extra hot during the day because what do you do to cool off? Well, you have to have water evaporating if you're going to cool off. So if they can tolerate those extra high body temperatures, then they don't have to use that water to cool off. And so they've got a whole series of, metabolic adaptations at the, throughout their whole system that allows them to tolerate those high body temperatures that you wouldn't be able to tolerate. Also, they have skin that's extra waterproof. Their skin is really not very permeable to water, and mammal skin is not that permeable to water to start with, but they have some extra waterproofing in their skin. Another big source of water loss is just evaporation from your lungs, because those lungs, they're moist. Every time you're inhaling this dry air. It's picking up moisture from your lungs, and then you're losing that moisture through evaporation. And so they have lungs that are very efficient at extracting oxygen from air, so they don't have to ventilate their lungs nearly as much as you would have to under the same circumstances. The other thing that they do is at night, they basically lower their metabolic rate. So at night, when the air temperature is cooler, their body temperature drops below normal. And so that means during the daytime, it takes quite a while before they actually heat up enough that they would have to start doing something to cool off their bodies. Some animals are periodic drinkers, so they're not getting a huge amount of water just using some alternative way, but they still have to drink, but they don't have to drink very often because they've got some water-saving adaptations. So camels, of course, are one of the prime examples of that. So there's some myths that say that camels have water stored in their humps. They don't have water stored in their humps. It is a fat reserve, and of course, when you do aerobic respiration on fat or anything else, it does create some water. So in that sense, there's some water that's going to be created when they metabolize those, that stored resource. But it's not just water sloshing around. So camels also allow their body temperature to drop dramatically at night and then warm up slowly during the day. So they're really not holding their body temperature constant, and that reduces the amount of water that they need to use for evaporative cooling during the day. Like the oryx, They also tolerate hyperthermia, so they don't, when their body temperature starts climbing, it doesn't really have a big effect on them until it starts getting really hot. They also have very efficient kidneys, so they are losing less water in their urine than other mammals of their size would be losing. And the main thing is that they can tolerate a really high loss of body water without any apparent ill effects. So most mammals are dead if they lose 20% of their body weight in water. Camels can lose up to 27% of their body weight in water before it starts to become a problem. And the reason is that camels are able to lose that water just from the interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that's outside the circulatory system that's just kind of bathing the cells without losing water from the blood. With most mammals, the interstitial fluid and the blood are, they're communicating all the time. They're really tied together. And so if you start losing water from the interstitial fluid, it's going to be replaced with water from the blood. And so you're effectively losing water from your blood. With camels, those two systems are much more separate, and so they can lose water from the interstitial fluid but maintain the blood volume and maintain the functioning of the blood, which is actually one of the things that kills you when you start getting dehydrated, is that your blood starts getting thick and it doesn't work as a transport medium very well anymore. There are also mammals in the desert that are water independent. That means they never drink. In fact, they don't even necessarily know what to do with water. If you gave them a bowl of water, they wouldn't even know what to do with it. And the way that they're able to accomplish, getting away with never drinking liquid water is that they're exceptionally good at reducing evaporative water loss. So there are several rodent families around the world that have evolved similar adaptations to become water independent. So they've evolved them independently. So it's convergent evolution. Our local example is the kangaroo rat, and actually there's a whole bunch of species of kangaroo rats, very common in the deserts of the Southwest. And you can see they kind of have got expanded hind legs. When they're just walking slowly, they'll use all fours, but when they're moving around at any speed, they're just hopping on their hind legs. And what they're basically doing is feeding on dry seeds. So they're hopping around the desert, and the seeds in the desert, they blow around and they kind of gather in low spots. So they're called wind-blown seed caches. And so they're hopping around until they find these seed caches, and then they feed on those. So you've got to cover a lot of ground because the seeds are not just spread out everywhere. They're in these little concentrated pockets, and so you've got to hop around and get to the next pocket to feed. So these animals never drink. The seeds they're eating are dry, so there is a little moisture in them, but it's very limited. But like any animal that can do cellular respiration, when you break down the macromolecules in those seeds, you are creating some water. You're chemically manufacturing new water molecules that weren't in there before. That's one of the byproducts of cellular respiration. So 100 grams of dry barley, when you metabolize it, is going to give you 54 grams of water. And if you're a kangaroo rat, it's the same thing. It's not that they are doing anything differently when it comes to cellular respiration. They're doing the same thing you do. So you could chew up those 100 grams of dry barley seeds and you're going to make 54 grams of water just like a kangaroo rat will. The difference comes at the other side of the equation. It's not the input, it's the water losses. You're terrible at controlling water losses. We perspire like crazy. Our urine is not very concentrated. We're losing moisture like crazy when we breathe. So we're not very good at hanging on to water. Kangaroo rats are exceptionally good at it. So here are just some of the adaptations that they have. So perspiration is a source of water loss. And like I say, for humans, we perspire like crazy, so we lose a lot of water this way. So how do kangaroo rats get around this? Well, they don't sweat. They don't have any sweat glands. and they're not active during the daytime. They're nocturnal. So even in the desert at night, you don't, you can control your body temperature a lot easier when the sun's not shining than when it is. So they just don't go out during the daytime. Pulmonary evaporation is the water that's lost by ventilating your lungs, by inhaling and exhaling. And so actually for kangaroo rats, this is their primary source of water loss. So what do they do to reduce it? Well, again, they're nocturnal. They're out and active when it's cooler and the humidity is higher at night. They stay in a damp burrow during the day, so the humidity inside the burrow, even though you're in a desert and the air is really dry, in that burrow the humidity is much higher, and so you're not as much water is evaporating off your lungs as it would if you were outside breathing the air. And they'll plug the burrow, so there's still enough oxygen in there that they can survive just fine, but that again prevents the air from getting exchanged with air, that drier air that's outside the burrow. You also will lose water in feces. Kangaroo rats have very efficient large intestines, and so they produce really dry feces. So only about 20% as much water is in kangaroo rat feces as in lab rat feces. Lab rats are not very good at conserving water. Urine is another major source of water loss. Kangaroo rats have very specialized kidneys. They've got gigantic loops of Henle, and so they are able to produce really concentrated urine, much more concentrated than we can produce. So that means they're losing very little water in their urine. So if you were to look at the sources of water intake and the sources of water loss and compare humans and kangaroo rats, this is what it looks like. This is maybe a little bit hard to interpret because of course kangaroo rats are tiny compared to humans. So how much water does a human need in a day? Well, okay, so 2,500 milliliters, yeah. And how much does a kangaroo rat need in a day? Well, 60 milliliters. Well, that's because it's a little animal. But if you look at the percentages, that is a little bit easier to compare. So how much water does a kangaroo rat need every day? Well, 100% of the water that it needs, and you also need 100% of what you need. So now we have a comparable unit. So if you look at the water intake, how much water do kangaroo rats drink? 0. They don't drink. How much of your water do you drink? About 60%. So you get about 60% of the water that you need just by drinking it. Water that's ingested in food, because food has some water in it, but kangaroo rats eat really dry food, so only about 10% of the water that they need is water that's in their food. We eat food that's got a lot more moisture in it. We're not just eating, dry seeds. So we get about 30% of the water that we need from our food. So take a look at the difference where we are right now. Just at this point, we're at 90% of the water that we need. Kangaroo rats are at 10% of the water that they need. So where does the rest come from? Well, it comes from that metabolic water. It comes from the water that they produce just doing cellular respiration. That's where they get 90% of their water. We get water from that too. Like I said, it's not that they're doing cellular respiration any differently than you are, but the amount the percentage of what we need that we get from that is tiny. It's only 10%. So very, very little. So that's the water. That's on the input side. Now let's take a look at the water loss side. So water that's just evaporating from the animal. So this would be, for kangaroo rats, it's mostly pulmonary loss from ventilating their lungs, from inhaling and exhaling. That's almost 3/4 of the water that they're losing comes from that. With us, 36%. And that's not because we're so efficient. We're not. It's just that we lose so much more in other ways. So in urine, 23% of the water loss for kangaroo rats is in their urine. For us, it's 60%. So basically, the amount of water that you actually drink is about the same as the amount of water you excrete in your urine on average. And then water lost in feces. Well, remember, kangaroo rats have really efficient large intestines, but it still translates to 4% of their water loss. And with us, even though we don't have super efficient large intestines, it's still about 4% for us too.